Bom dia, oficialmente, sejam muito bem-vindos. Gostaríamos de apresentar para vocês a Academia Finatec, a Finatec, e nós preparamos um vídeo institucional para apresentar a fundação, que é a principal fundação de apoio da Universidade de Brasília, e agora eu gostaria de apresentar a vocês a nossa instituição.
Bom, gente, bom dia a todos, mais uma vez. Nós vamos então dar início ao nosso webinar sobre aspectos económicos de sistemas de vigilância em saúde única. E eu gostaria só de, antes de começar o evento, mais uma vez dizer que este webinar, apesar de ter um tema muito específico, ele está enquadrado num evento maior em que a maioria dos presentes participaram, muito focado na questão da vigilância da raiva transmitida por morcegos. Já tivemos um webinar que começou na terça-feira, com um webinar mais técnico sobre esse tema. Prosseguimos quarta e quinta com uma reunião de trabalho com os pontos focais nos estados ligados a esse projeto, e os colegas do Ministério da Agricultura. E, antes de mais, então, de novo, agradecer, um agradecimento final ao Ministério da Agricultura, ao próprio IICA, pelo financiamento deste trabalho, deste projeto, e um agradecimento à organização do evento, à Finatec, em particular, à Aline, e a toda a equipe técnica que nos tem ajudado, incluindo os próprios intérpretes que estão ajudando a fazer um evento um pouco mais abrangente, internacional. O evento de hoje, a língua original dele, digamos assim, será em inglês, uma vez que temos participantes que vão falar em inglês, para não ficar o tempo inteiro mudando do português para o inglês, fica mais fácil quando começarmos, de fato, as apresentações e depois a discussão, será em inglês e vocês, como sabem, têm tradução simultânea ao longo de todo o processo. Portanto, eu vou passar a apresentação do primeiro palestrante e, a partir de agora, então, vou passar para a língua inglesa, e, portanto, fiquem à vontade, quem quiser entrar no canal respectivo de tradução. So I'm going to first thank Professor Jonathan Rushton for kindly being with us today and talk about economics in in One Health programs. And I'm going to briefly present him before he actually starts his talk. Professor Rushton is an agricultural economist who specializes in the economics of animal health and food systems. His principal research interests are at the moment the global burden of animal diseases, where he's directing a global program with the OIE, and also economics of antimicrobial use and resistance in livestock, and assessment of multidimensionality of food quality and public health. He's recently completed studies on the economics of antimicrobial use in livestock in Southeast Asia for FAO, and the economics of new livestock vaccines for a EU-funded project that is currently involved in research on antimicrobial use in livestock in Vietnam, India, and the EU. He's working with IAD on the economic dimensions of sustainable laboratory systems, a project funded by the OIE. Jonathan also embraces One Health approaches in the search for solutions for society's health problems. He's currently a professor of animal health and food systems economics at the Institute of Infection, Veterinary and Ecological Sciences at the University of Liverpool, and leads a University Center of Excellence for Sustainable Food Systems, and is also part of the N8 Agri-Food program. Is also adjunct professor in the School of Behavioral, Cognitive and Social Sciences of the University of New England, Australia, and president of the International Society for Economics and Social Sciences of Animal Health. In 2020, he became a senior EAD fellow in epidemiology at Texas A&M. So I should add to this introduction that Jonathan and I worked together in the 90s. You do the math, so it was quite a long time ago. When we were about 30, we're approaching 60 now. And that was at the Veterinary Epidemiology and Economics Research Unit, which was sort of groundbreaking group funded by Peter Ellis that almost 50 years ago started bringing economics into the world of epidemiology and animal health with a very practical approach. And that changed a lot of things in the world of epidemiology, I think. The thing is, we were doing this in the 80s, in the 90s, and it seemed to be a new field, a very interesting and very exciting development to actually bring epidemiology into animal health as a tool for providing animal health solutions. And actually, we didn't use that word in those days, but One Health solutions, but with an economic perspective. The world was very different then. We didn't have cell phones, internet, and a lot of these things. It was very strange, probably for many people watching us. And the world changed a lot, but I'm not so sure the world of economics in animal health problems and actually changed that much. But one thing I'm certain is that no one did so much to actually develop this field over the last 20, 25 years as Jonathan Rushton. So I'm very pleased and see what he has to say to us now. So I'm very pleased I'm very thankful to have Jonathan with us today, as well as Sarah and Sylvia, but I'll present Sarah after Jonathan's talk. So just a note of order, we'll proceed with the two talks without questions in between. And at the end of the two talks, we'll have fairly long time for discussion that will be moderated by Professor Silvia Miranda from the University of São Paulo. So please feel free to use the chat to raise questions, because we'll be taking notes throughout, and then we'll group them in main topics, and so you can provide your own inputs to the discussion. Okay, so now to Jonathan, and again, Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us.
Vitor, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and also for inviting me to talk today. It's a great pleasure taking part in this event. It's a little bit of a shame that I couldn't be in Brazil, but it's a country I'm very fond of. I lived 8.5 years in Bolivia and spent 1 or 2 occasions actually visiting Brazil and working with Vitor back in the 1990s, in the 2000s. So Vitor came to me and asked me to talk a little bit about the economics of surveillance, and I'm going to approach this in a slightly different way, because I think Sarah's going to cover more detail about the economics of surveillance. I want to talk a little bit more carefully about the economic of assessment of interventions and the need for good baselines and the role for surveillance in that process. This is a piece of work that's from me, but also with my staff at Liverpool. And it also involves contributions from people across the world who are working in the Global Burden of Animal Diseases team. And I want to start with a challenge which I thought about back in 2015 when I gave a talk at ISFI that Vitor also gave a keynote presentation at, where I kind of see the world from an economic perspective of thinking about how do we understand the context in which we're keeping animals, how would we identify weak resource allocation, understand why it's weak, and then reallocate resources. And yet, what I've increasingly done during my career is a slightly different approach, what I would call an animal health approach, where somebody comes to me and talks to me and says a disease is important, it might be FMD or it might be bovine tuberculosis. They usually have a strategy already developed and they want an economic justification to make sure it happens, and the program begins if it's accepted by the financiers. There's obviously a difference between these two approaches. With the economic approach, we're looking at adding value through searching for optimality. And I think largely the way we've used economics in animal health is actually thinking about adding value through advocacy. And I think our challenge in the next time period is how do we bring these two things together? And one of the things that I think is very important as we start to begin that discussion or that thought process is actually we've got two different languages. So with any disciplines groupings, we tend to talk in a slightly different way. We use different terminologies. So if we look at the economics and finance area, we're thinking about things like labor productivity, employment, gross domestic product per person, fiscal deficits, surpluses, returns on investment if you're talking to business people. But in our surveillance world, we're very much wedded to the kind of technical biological side of thinking about the sensitivity and specificity of tests, the incidence or prevalence of diseases, R-naughts, cases per 100,000, time to detection, case fertility rate. Now, this language here has become incredibly familiar to us during this COVID-19 crisis, but I'm not sure this language over here has become very familiar to us. And it's trying to translate our very strong, pervasive surveillance language and translating it into the kinds of things that will light the boxes for our economics and finance people. So I'm going to start with a couple of premises that I want us to sort of remember as I go through the presentation. I think our surveillance systems need to start very seriously including socioeconomic data that they capture and analyze alongside the disease work. And the reason for doing that in part is because I think we need to generate information not just about disease presence and absence or disease levels, but we also need to think carefully about the economic impact of animal health and welfare of the animals we keep in society. And if our surveillance systems start to be able to do that, they can start to translate that surveillance terminology into a language that can be appreciated by economists, finance ministers, and financial directors. And with that, and this is my hypothesis, we could well start to achieve a more sustainable flow of resources, both to support surveillance activities, but also to think about the more wide-ranging mitigation work that we need to do in the livestock sector to actually achieve better outcomes for society. So what I'm going to cover with the talk in general, with that background, is why do we need baselines to understand normal patterns? How might we use those baselines to actually trigger active investigations? And then what do we do with that in terms of thinking about generating decent economic assessments on interventions of things like surveillance, prevention and control, our classic mitigation measures? So let's start with thinking a bit about baselines themselves. A baseline obviously indicates an initial situation. We might go to a farm and think more carefully about, from a business point of view, what kind of gross margin is there? What's the difference between our variable costs and our output from a system? What kind of profit levels are the farmers actually achieving? From a surveillance perspective, we might be interested in thinking about which diseases we have in that population, what health problems do we have, are they at acceptable levels, is mortality at an acceptable level? And for trade-related diseases, which Brazil is very, very familiar with its successful campaigns on control and eradication of classical swine fever and foot and mouth disease, we want to have diseases at a zero level. We want to have an absence of them. But it's actually pretty rare that a surveillance system actually generates the acceptable levels of production, of movement and disease impact. My own country wasn't tracking production or movement when we had our foot and mouth disease outbreak in 2001. So actually we didn't understand the risk profile that was actually going on in the country at that time. And we allowed really a movement of disease across the country because we didn't understand the movement patterns and the risk issues attached to that. So how do we use those baselines? And again, from a sort of economic point of view, we perhaps go down to a farm level where we're thinking about that difference between the variable costs and output to estimate the gross margin. We could do comparisons between cropping and cattle enterprises. And with disease impact assessments, we might want to start to compare what we think is a total burden of, say, something like foot and mouth disease against a disease like African swine fever and do some kind of comparison. Now, these numbers are very attractive. Everybody likes to see big numbers. Everybody likes to sort of do comparisons. But to actually interpret them and actually generate useful information, we need to understand how they're generated. And with a gross margin or with a disease impact assessment, we should really pull apart how they've been calculated, whether the analyses that have been done are actually from a similar time period, and whether we can actually make comparable estimates between different situations. So a single number from these baselines usually isn't enough to actually do very much with. We need to actually pull it apart a little bit and understand all the empirical data and the assumptions that actually support that figure. So once we have a baseline, we've got a basis for actually doing economic analysis of animal health interventions. And it's important that we use those baselines because we must remember that actually without the intervention, something else would have happened. So we actually have to have a baseline to sort of model the future or even the past without that intervention taking place. If we're doing an analysis for the private sector, we need to understand how we improve profitability and the outcomes for a farmer or a food business operator. And such an analysis needs to take a baseline where we're taking into account the opportunity cost of not investing in other activities because of the animal health situation we're looking at. When we're doing work for the government, it's slightly different. The government is searching for solutions that actually shortcut the development of the livestock sector through better animal health issues. And it's looking for ways to actually develop that sector faster that couldn't have been done without that government intervention taking place. And our baseline is actually the underlying trends of the kind of private sector operations that are actually driving that sector forward with a certain health status. So in a very sort of simplistic term, we perhaps think about an intervention over a 10-year period with some kind of estimate of the benefits less the costs, and then align with regards to the intervention. And it might be assumed that we can take a fairly simple, straightforward assumption that everything below that line is actually the benefits. But we need to fit the baseline. So we need to have a situation where we've got a without the intervention situation and a with the intervention situation to actually estimate the net benefit of the intervention. Now, that's actually a very simple situation where we're assuming that everything remains the same across that time period without the intervention. What normally happens, which is slightly more complex, is that even without the intervention, there will be a slow improvement in the animal health situation. And therefore, the with intervention will probably have a period of intervention investment and then followed by a benefit of the intervention. But in all cases, the shape and the nature of our baseline actually dictates whether this will be an economically profitable situation. So baselines are really useful in terms of establishing what normal patterns should be expected in terms of disease, health, and economic impacts. They can also be very helpful in terms of actually referencing how we trigger responses and generate active investigation. So it could be fluctuations in production. Probably the best example we've seen of this recently has been the detection of Schmallenberg virus in Germany, which was partly triggered by people understanding that there was a problem with milk supply, a fluctuation which stimulated an investigation which led to the actual detection of a new virus. Baselines can also be the basis for economic assessments, I've just explained. Yet, one of the things that bothers me and has bothered me all my career is what baselines actually exist for surveillance, and is surveillance contributing to the generation and the use of baselines? So moving on from that, let's just think a little bit about what baselines actually exist for the impact of diseases and what kinds of things will we include. So in a kind of fairly straightforward model, we would think very carefully about health losses, things like visible losses that occur, dead animals, even dead people. The invisible losses, which require a whole range of epidemiological skills to estimate, so things like fertility problems, delayed sale of animals and products. And then our reaction to those health losses with regards to expenditure and reaction. So it could be medicines and vaccines, additional costs, but it can also be about lost revenue, access to better markets, or suboptimal use of technologies. These two aspects together are our combined health impact. And we need to recognize there's an impact caused by the diseases and the health problems, and also an impact caused by human reaction. And economists are constantly balancing those two things. So every time we spend money on this side, so we start to spend millions and millions of reales on the impact caused by the human reaction, then we're anticipating we're going to avoid some of the losses due to the health loss issue. Okay, so it's like a balancing act between these 2 points. And that means that in some situations, it may be a comfortable economic conclusion to actually have circulating disease because it's not economically profitable to actually eradicate that problem. And that's something that many veterinarians and animal health specialists find quite difficult. So an economic equilibrium between these things is actually a possibility in that structure. So what kind of information do we have across those two spaces? Well, if we go to the human health field, we've got the global burden of disease, which has been run since the 1980s. It's based on the estimation of the loss of health measured as a disability adjusted life year. And if you're interested in that, please look at Chris Murray's work in this field. He began this process and has been running it since that 1980s period. There's also systems across the world that actually capture quite accurately how much money is spent in human health. And it's possible to divide that into categories of public, private, and development assistance. Now, in combination there, we've got a very powerful data set which actually looks at the input and the output from the human health system. And we can pick that up off the web pages. So if you go to the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation webpage, then you'll find these kinds of heat maps of different diseases. This is the global burden of diseases measured in disability adjusted life years in 1990 and 2019. The different colors represent different types of things. So the red color largely represents infectious diseases. This blue color is mainly around non-communicable diseases, and the green color is around injuries, accidents. We can also find the health financing issues across slightly different time periods. It's not quite as broad a data set as the other one. Different colors represent different types of support. So the blue is the government, The middle part is out-of-pocket private expenditure, and then the top part is about insurance costs. And we can see that between 1995 and 2017, there's actually been an increase per capita in human health expenditure. And we can even get down to details for Brazil, which go all the way down to state level, actually, not just down to Brazil, its country. And we can check and see whether there's been an improvement of health over time. So according to the data held by IHME, in 1990, there was roughly 40,000 DALYs per 100,000 people in Brazil. And by 2019, that had actually reduced to 30,000. So actually an improvement in health over time, and also a changing pattern of diseases. So less infectious diseases, and much more important are the non-communicable diseases in that particular structure. And we can look at the health financing. So part of that improvement in health has been due to an increase in expenditure. And it's changed from about $500 per person in 1995 to $817 in 2017. Now, this kind of information then becomes quite important. We can actually start to analyse and check to see whether policy changes in Brazil or in the global level are actually having impacts that are positive with regards overall changes of health overall, but also in the patterns of disease. And we can see that Brazil has actually managed to control pretty successfully a lot of infectious disease issues, and has also managed to sort of bring down the disability adjusted life years across the population during that time period. So a nice sort of success story. But when we go to the burden of disease and health in animals, it's a very different picture. We've got some global estimations for individual animal diseases. The work I did with Theo Knight-Jones that we published in 2012 for FMD was a very sort of broad sweeping overview of what we thought was the case at the time. I think you can pull apart some of the analysis we did, but it was an attempt to actually look at that. Dama Blake at the Royal Veterinary College has recently published something on coccidiosis in poultry. We've got a nice country level study for Great Britain, which looked at a small group of endemic diseases led by Richard Bennett at the University of Reading, but that's never been repeated. And there's actually no real systematic collection of data on the losses of production or expenditure in animal health. If you even look for the expenditure part in animal health, it's very difficult to get hold of those data. And in general, there's no real agreed method for the estimation of the burden of animal diseases, which would be similar to the DALYs and global financing work that's done for human health. So at the moment, we have no system that captures the burdens of animal diseases at either a local, national, or global level. And for an economist, that's a problem because we don't have those data sets where we can do analysis, we can check to see whether our policies, our shifts in expenditure are making a difference overall. And hence, the build-up really is that we have started this global burden of animal disease program. We've been in a planning phase for a couple of years. We're now supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to actually take this forward in terms of a rollout program. And I'm going to work through and just explain to you what we're doing. So the approach we're taking here is not straight away a disease focus. It's a focus on the health and welfare of animals, which in part is due to infectious diseases, but not only due to infectious diseases. So it differs from the current infectious disease focus that most animal health assessments actually take. And it follows the kind of pattern of investigation that we use for human health losses. Now, for some people, not taking this immediate disease focus might make people uncomfortable because it's new. But I think for livestock keepers who are struggling to manage endemic diseases, production problems, even injuries, accidents, and predation, it might be a relief to see a process that actually includes all those problems rolled together. And I'm going to sort of try and explain to you what we're doing in that process. So our analytical structure at the moment starts with the livestock populations. We want to estimate the biomass and also the economic investment in those animals and the infrastructure that we require to look after them. We're then going to calculate something we're calling the animal health loss envelope. Don't worry too much about that terminology. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And we won't need to understand how much are we losing and how much are we spending from that animal health loss envelope. So this again mirrors that burden of disease I talked about before, the spending and also the loss of production. We then want to attribute that by disease, health problems and accidents to understand the absolute burden for each disease or maybe a syndrome, and also its relative contribution to the total burden that we've calculated here with the animal health loss envelope. Once we've done these calculations, which are very much more at a sort of farm level, sector level issue, we want to think more carefully about the impact across the economy. What we'd like to do is actually assess who across the society is actually affected by this burden of animal diseases. Is it consumers? Is it the food system? Is it the livestock producers? Is it the input providers? So let's start from the perspective of thinking about where we go from populations all the way to numbers. So we'd start with, say, 1.8 million dairy cows. This is roughly the number of dairy cows we find in the UK. You can perhaps split them up into different categories in terms of their intensity of grazing use. And once we get down to a certain level, we might want to think more carefully about the farm size itself before we get down to the actual individual farmer in that situation. Now, at each of these levels, we could do a calculation of that animal health loss envelope and also some attribution scores. Biomass is critical with regards taking this forward. I say this from the perspective that increasingly in the world, we've got problems with regards to environmental footprint of diseases. So we need to assess the total weight of the animals to understand the pressures on grazing and forage, feed inputs in terms of the intensive use of concentrates or housing, waste and slurry management, but also that production of methane gases and other air pollutants. Biomass may well change over time with changing demands of livestock. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you come to my country, we tend to only eat turkey during the Christmas period. So there will be an increase in the amount of biomass of turkeys in the UK from maybe about the midpoint of the year all the way through to Christmas, and then it drops again quite suddenly. Breeding seasons also make a change in the biomass aspect across the world. And yet this biomass is actually not widely available as a database. It's not particularly well studied. So we are discussing at the moment within the team how we do this. Should we use standard conversion factors to actually calculate the biomass? Should we start using slaughter weights and killing out percentages? Or should we get even more complex in the sense of looking at the herd structure, the growth rates, the slaughter weights, and also the agreed killing out percentages to get a much more refined estimation of biomass? Now, whether this makes a huge difference, I'm not so sure, but our initial calculations for our work done in Ethiopia indicate that with these first more crude versions, we're looking at something like about 11 million tonnes of biomass in the cattle sector. With the more refined process, it's more like 15 million tonnes. And that's obviously quite a big difference across those population groupings. Now let's go on to the animal health loss envelope. So we have our population, we have our population model. We start to look at that and generate from that population model an enterprise budget. How much is being produced? What variable costs are being demanded? What fixed costs are being used? And from that, we can calculate the profitability of our livestock system at this particular point in time, with all the health problems and all the disease problems imbued in it. We then reset that population model and we take out things like mortality. We improve the fertility. We generate better growth rates, better lactation curves to calculate an enterprise budget in terms of output variable costs and fixed costs. The difference between these two enterprise budgets then allows us to calculate this animal health loss envelope, which captures the net loss in production and the expenditure that's caused by the presence or even the risks of diseases in that particular system, before we then move on to start thinking more carefully about the attribution of that animal health loss envelope to causes and risk factors. This concept of the animal health loss envelope is something that's not new. It's used in crop science. It's also been used by Mario Herrero, who's leading our production systems and populations theme within the GBADS program. And Mario has calculated something he calls live gaps, the difference between actual production and potential production, to actually understand what we're missing out on by having inefficient systems. This sounds quite simple, but it tends to be quite tricky. We have to set the ceiling. What is the utopia? And our basic premise within the GBADS program is that we have a situation where the animals are free of disease, they have adequate nutrition and water, and they're also free from accidents, injuries, and predation. We're planning to use simple dynamic models to generate possibly the population growth, but we're also experimenting with the possibility that we actually constrain the output to current levels. I'm increasingly moving towards the idea of constraining output, and that in part reflects the fact that we're in a situation in the world now where we don't need more output actually from our livestock sectors. We need to think more carefully about our use of land, water and air from our livestock sector because of the environmental issues we're doing. So we need population models that reflect what's going on in these systems. Our movement of adults all the way through to the young and the immature adults, with all the aspects of growth rate and fertility rates built in, the mortality rates, the offtake rates, and of course the production of things like fibre, milk and eggs. And we need to calculate the efficiency shifts with the presence of diseases. So we have functions here where our output is related to the use of working capital, our variable costs, our use of labour, and also the use of fixed capital, which in part represents our livestock themselves, our investment in the animals, as well as the infrastructure that we're using. And we need to focus on that working capital part, the feed, forage and vet meds that's actually used to manage our animals well, the labour, the investment in animals and the infrastructure. If we constrain the output to remain constant, what we do is actually we remove mortality and morbidity, which actually shifts the size and age structure of our livestock population. And we can use that population model to actually understand a little bit more carefully how we can then attribute that by different disease and causes. As we change the size of the livestock populations and their age structure, we will have a reduction in the need for feed, forage, labour and fixed capital. We'll actually be freeing up resources by removing those problems from our livestock sectors. And actually we'll understand a little bit better the efficiency challenges we have in place because of the problems of animal health across that population. So in summary, we need a range of data. Some of these data will be familiar to you when you start doing any kind of assessments of impact. And we need population models that generate the information about that animal health loss envelope so we can calculate both the net loss in production and the expenditure in animal health. That provides us with a range of information. In that utopian population, what will be the herd structure and its weight? With regards to the information we generate on the net loss of production, we can understand a bit more carefully about productivity changes. And we have also got information here with regards to the expenditure overall. Now, we set that animal health loss envelope for a reason. It means that we can't go outside it. We can't have more losses than actually exist in that animal health loss envelope. And then we can start to attribute by the different problems we experience. So in a pig system, we might want to start thinking about classical swine fever, PRRS, pneumonia or strep suis. And as we improve our surveillance systems, we can probably start adding in certain things that we would consider to be issues that are more about production or endemic diseases. But you'll notice across every particular sweep of that, there's still some part of that animal health loss envelope that's actually not attributed. So how do we start to use our surveillance system in this? Well, we need to think carefully about how we're measuring diseases, the clinical symptoms, or our diagnostics work with regards to antigen or antibody issues, whether we're using measures that actually have internationally recognized standards. And the truth is, not many diseases have this process fully in play at the moment. So we need ontologies to actually allow comparisons between countries and production systems. Ontologies being something where we can translate how we measure things in one place and compare it to another. Do we use prevalence or incidence when we start to do disease impacts? There's actually a difference between these two things. And the human health side has switched backwards and forwards with regards whether it uses prevalence or incidence. How are the impacts on production parameters captured? There are a number of studies for things like foot and mouth disease, which will actually look more carefully at the impact on lactation yield, but they may not have information about the mortality rate changes. And will we only look at syndromes rather than diseases where we've got an absence of data? Now, João Afonso, who's working with me and has actually worked with Vitor in Brazil in the past, he's looking at this more carefully from a perspective of thinking about lameness in dairy cattle in the UK. He's gone through a systematic review to actually look and see how we're measuring lameness in the UK. And he's come up with about 17 different types of ways of measuring lameness. So there's quite a number of different ways of measuring. We have to understand whether they're comparable or not. And therefore, we need to develop ontologies to actually compare across different studies. He's then gone on to actually look and see how they've calculated things. So these studies have generated issues around prevalence, but they've also generated information about incidence. And actually, do we use one or the other with regards to our impact studies? But once we come across those problems, we can start to then attribute by the different problems. We can think more carefully about attributing the production loss and the expenditure by the different problems we have, and then do a combination of the two things to understand whether we've got good resource allocation between our expenditure and the loss picture that we've got within that system. So here again, we're starting to look more carefully at the economics of that situation rather than just the presence or absence or even the levels of diseases. And again, the population model comes into play because we can add in those diseases into our population models to understand its impact on things like fertility rate, mortality rates, or the outputs of things like milk, fiber, or eggs. And with regards thinking about syndromes rather than specific diseases, work we've done fairly recently has actually put together things like bovine respiratory diseases because we couldn't actually separate out the problems in a place like France to actually calculate the impact on efficiency in those situations. And we've done little bits of work with regards thinking about the global impact of the loss of meat in the chicken and swine sector. This is work done by Kevin Watkins in the US. Quite a wide range of variation across that time period, with between 5.8 to nearly $20 billion lost in a year. Everything I've talked about so far is very much about farm level impacts. We want to think carefully about how do those farm level impacts associate themselves with maybe intra-household issues. Does it affect women? Does it affect men? Does it affect the children in the family? So those are things that we need to think more carefully about. And we need to think about how it affects our food systems. Brazil is probably one of the most complex livestock production systems in the world. Many industries that you have in Brazil export products internationally. They're very dependent on quite complex food systems that require thought about how changes in our livestock output actually impacts across the economy and also in terms of government expenditure to get a better idea about the total economic impacts. My colleagues, Dustin Pendle and Tom Marsh, have done this kind of work to look at the potential impact of foot and mouth disease in the US. And what they've done, they've broken up the impact of a change in the food system and actually started to try and understand a little bit better whether some particular parts of that food system are impacted negatively or positively. So with regards foot and mouth disease, there's a range of negative impacts, but also some sectors recover much more quickly. For example, the beef cattle industry is estimated to recover quite quickly after a foot and mouth disease outbreak because the beef that would have been exported is actually consumed internally. So even before they regain market access internationally, there is a recovery because of the internal demand for beef. And we can break up that impact in terms of consumer impacts, but also trade impacts. So we move beyond that farm level. We use information which looks at the economy model at a utopian and current level to think about almost like an animal health loss envelope at an economy-wide scale. And we try and break that up in terms of different types of disease scenarios to do a stepwise estimation of that impact across the wider economy. So we're moving from livestock populations, breaking up in terms of species, thinking more carefully about how the production systems influence how these animals are kept, estimating that animal health loss envelope by comparing our current levels of production with a utopian ceiling, then dividing this up, attributing it by different types of diseases, production problems, accidents, predation, and linking that back into wider economy models. Now, we need data to actually do this properly. And we are welcoming any opportunity to link with people. We're already talking, Vitor and I, about the possibility of doing some work in Brazil, and I look forward to the opportunities to do this. We need analytical structures to sort of help this process, from population models all the way down to wider economy models, to generate a useful set of data around biomass, but also around the whole economics of animal disease process. And I would argue that as we move forward, this needs to be part of our modified surveillance system. This data capture across the economy and the disease space, the analysis to actually generate something that we can translate our surveillance and prevalence issues into economic terminology. So the framework I've described is quite innovative. But it's relatively simple. There are some bits of complexity that we're still working on. It can be applied at different scales, at a global, national, local level, and also at a household level. And it generates a whole range of accessible information: animal biomass, the economic investment in animals, two things that are not currently available in any economy that I know of: the animal health loss envelope, the estimation of the loss of production and expenditure, the attribution by disease, nutrition and accidents, and the wider economic impacts. And our intention into the future is that we start to publish the same kinds of data that the human burden of disease works on, with a slightly refined thing. So we're looking at loss of production and expenditure. And we should aim to do this over periods of time, probably working historically as well as moving forward, to actually understand patterns of change with regards to the burden of diseases over time. And also at different scales, doing global work, doing country level work, and coming all the way down to local level impacts. If we do this well, and it's our intention to do it well, we start to identify where we've got inadequate animal health investments. We can also look more carefully where investments in animal health are actually badly allocated. They're not targeting the right sort of diseases or health problems. If we generate longitudinal data sets, we start to have the power to actually evaluate past animal health policies and projects, and we improve the baselines for future evaluations of investments. So the better mapping of animal health investments actually allows us to say something more carefully about the sustainable development goals that we're actually targeting. So we start to leave behind a legacy built on this spine of moving from populations to burdens of diseases, generates a range of information that's useful for both the animal health sector, but also the investors in the animal health sector. And we start to generate a range of tools, a range of educational materials, and codes of best practice of the use of economics of animal health across different parts of the livestock sector globally. So I just want to finish with a quick reflection. I'd argue very strongly that surveillance needs to be strengthened to generate better information on the levels of disease and health problems in different livestock populations around the world. And it also needs to broaden the data capture to actually include livestock production, animal health, animal and livestock product movement, and market prices. And if we start to combine that information, a surveillance system should actually be able to generate more consistently the economic burden of animal health and welfare in a language that our economists, our finance directors, and our finance ministers start to understand. If they can start to understand that, there's a better chance we'll get better financing for the kinds of animal health systems that we actually want. So we need to move to a situation where we have this link between, that should say susceptible livestock populations, not bird populations, but the link between our animal populations and our producers. We need a surveillance system that captures socioeconomics, captures the livestock sector, captures wildlife and disease interfaces. Based on a passive surveillance system, we should be able to generate pathogen banks, and through that information, actually develop and assess vaccines and diagnostics more effectively. We've got enough data here to do analysis where we combine the surveillance system data with the pathogen banks and trigger active disease searches or improved diagnostics, but also plan more carefully rational and proportionate disease control measures. And the aim from this system is that we build all that data together to think more carefully about how people and animals and disease circulate in society. So we can actually do pretty strong economic analysis, assess the impact of diseases, the burden of diseases, look at control strategies, think about their cost and cost effectiveness, and think about the justification through cost-benefit analysis and sustainability issues to actually influence policy-making decision at the end. I want to thank my funders and partners and collaborators who've helped enormously in bringing this thinking together. And I want to thank again Vitor for making the invitation to talk today. I look forward to questions later on. Yeah, back to you, Vitor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we'll move now to the second talk, which I'm going to share my screen. So now we have a presentation by Dr. Sara Bob Martins, who graduated as a veterinarian from the University of Lisbon in 2005 and holds an MSc and PhD from the Royal Veterinary College, University of London. Her work and research has focused on zoonoses and on how One Health approaches can be used to tackle health issues at the human-animal ecosystems interface, something really relevant to the kind of topics we've been discussing this week. Her research interests include the use of economic tools and thinking to better understand the added value of One Health approaches. Sara is currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Swiss National Science Foundation project tackling the second deadliest neglected tropical disease, which is predicting and reducing the impact of snake bite on human and animal health through interdisciplinary analysis of hotspots and access to care. It's called Snakebite. In the project, she focuses on the assessment of dual human health and livelihood economic impact of snakebite in a One Health perspective. So I'll pass the floor now to Sara, please.
Thank you, Vitor. Good morning, everyone. Again, thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to present in this webinar. And I'll be talking in the coming 40 minutes, more or less, on the economic assessment of surveillance from a One Health perspective. And in this presentation, I will start by talking a little bit about One Health, about what One Health surveillance is, also on how to frame this economic assessment. How can we look into the economics of One Health surveillance and understand benefits, understand costs to derive value? I'll also be showing some examples of where this assessment, or where we carried this assessment, so some practical examples. And I will conclude just by identifying some challenges and opportunities. So we know that in the last decades, there's been a growing recognition of the impact of health threats at the interface of humans, animals, and their ecosystems in society. And that has really prompted not only the scientific community, but also decision makers to look for cross-cutting holistic approaches to human, animal, and ecosystems health. Such One Health approaches that include the health of animals, the health of humans, and the health of environment are very much based on principles of multi-sectorial work and have as a basis the principle that we should attain better health levels by working together. Certainly, the last year and COVID has very much placed a very strong spotlight on One Health, possibly as never before. So within this growing momentum, there's certainly also the growing understanding that we need to start to better integrate and share information from the animal population, the human population, and the ecosystems. And that is increasingly seen as key to efficient health systems. Now, one of the main rationales that is frequently pulled across is this potential for early detection. The potential that we might have that by noting either an emerging pathogen or a certain change in the pathogen level, we might be able to act quickly and therefore prevent cases. Certainly, for example, if we're able to prevent cases in humans, if we're able to detect very early on the pathogen, either in the environment or potentially in the animal population. And that principle is the basis to think about surveillance from a One Health lens. Now, the exact definition of what One Health surveillance is very much like One Health in itself, not completely set in stone, and there's multiple definitions that you can find in the literature. I just pulled some to this presentation, and please have a look if you're interested to read in detail. What I've done is summarize from all these four definitions what I think they all have in common. They certainly, surveillance continues to be, per definition, the systematic collection and analysis of data. But for One Health surveillance, that effort is across sectors, at least two sectors, from human health, animal health, plant health, wildlife, environmental. And this sharing of information or integration of information can occur actually in multiple ways at multiple stages of the surveillance process. And that is indeed to produce evidence to have always the outcome of an improved health outcome across sectors. So improving aspects of human, animal, and environmental sectors. And whilst there's this growing understanding for sure, and the growing acknowledgement that One Health surveillance actually makes a lot of sense, the majority of surveillance systems, for zoonoses at least, continue to be species specific. So operating independently, we tend to see human health surveillance streams and animal health surveillance streams. But there is an increasing intent for integration, and authors that have looked into it have done literature review to see how much integration or how much movement towards a One Health design of surveillance. I found back in 2010 that only 90% of systems for zoonoses are actually covering both animal and human populations. Then Halliday and colleagues found 43% of these systems actually including animal and human populations. And more recently, Wendt and colleagues found 20 systems, but with this increasing trend. And there's quite a lot of good examples from the literature. One that is possibly the most well established in terms of, certainly in terms of length and longevity, is the Danish Integrated Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring and Research Program, DANMAP. And this is certainly a One Health surveillance system that has been in place since 1995. It's a system that's been collecting resistance data, also usage data from humans and animals, on zoonotic bacteria, other indicator bacteria, with multiple sampling sites from hospitals to slaughterhouses. And quite interestingly, DANMAP has allowed to generate a large enough and strong enough body of evidence that has actually translated into important policy changes. So data collected by DANMAP was pivotal, for example, on introducing a ban on the use of antimicrobials for growth promotion in Denmark, but also at the European Union level, as trends between usage and resistance were detected by this system. And it's also been pivotal in identifying the list of critically important antimicrobial agents. Another great example of how a One Health surveillance system can operate comes from Italy and the West Nile virus integrated surveillance system in Emilia-Romagna. Now, this region of Italy has been doing surveillance of West Nile at least since 2009 in multiple species, mosquitoes, birds, and humans, but they started to see they were detecting the virus circulation 3 to 4 weeks before the appearance of actually West Nile virus disease in humans. And by 2013, they decided that the public health actions were going to take place based on the detection of the virus circulation whilst still in animals and not in humans anymore as it was before. So that's very strongly based on the early warning sign that detection of a pathogen, in this case in mosquitoes, birds, and horses, could be giving to prompt public health action. Now, whilst technically we have all the technical arguments, I think, to make sense of One Health surveillance, understanding the added value of surveillance in economic terms, exactly pinpointing its added value, it's still very much a work in progress. There's some arguments that have been put across, not only for One Health surveillance, but for One Health in general. For example, the potential to improve effectiveness of interventions, the potential, and this has been shown by sharing saving on the operational costs for surveillance, but also for intervention, for example, vaccination campaigns and other mitigation strategies, the potential to better detect disease, but also this potential to have public health benefits by controlling disease while still in its animal reservoir, certainly been shown for brucellosis and for rabies. But it's always put across that it's one of the obstacles yet to the wider deployment of One Health efforts in disease mitigation, the fact that we need more evidence exactly of this added value. And that's where economic assessment comes into play. And we've seen in the presentation of Jonathan how important it can be. It allows us to compare options in terms of costs and consequences of our policies and programs. It allows us to understand the impact of health threats and see the benefits of any intervention, including surveillance. And it gives us a pathway on how to reach the greatest socioeconomic value relative to a cost. Now, for surveillance, but really for any other policy or program for health, we can do economic assessment at various stages of implementation. This is at the design stage, for example, even before implementing, we can use economic assessment to give us evidence for prioritization and for decision making. It allows us to understand the impact of diseases to health and well-being. We saw thoroughly in Jonathan's presentation how important that is. It allows us to provide key evidence for advocacy and awareness raising. This is particularly important, I would say, for the case of neglected tropical diseases. It allows us to understand how to better plan interventions, deliver health services, including surveillance, to improve disease outcomes, reduce health inequities. And importantly, and particularly from an analyst point of view, when doing an economic assessment, still at the design stage, we understand where data gaps are, and by doing so, we can shape either research agenda for research efforts, also shape surveillance needs, so we can redesign the surveillance system to capture the data that we actually need to then evaluate the surveillance system. And then we can use this evidence also, and we should actually be doing for any program on policy at some point in mid-implementation or at the end to provide an evaluation of interventions, programs, and policies. And at that stage, it will allow us to understand if what we've done and the interventions we implemented were effective and if reached the targeted we had for them, and also understand if the resources we had were used optimally. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the specifics exactly for the economics of One Health surveillance, because looking at surveillance and understanding benefits and costs has some specificities. And that is because for most interventions, we can see health outcomes directly. So if we're analyzing, for example, cost effectiveness of a vaccination campaign, we can see changes in population, in the disease population. Jonathan mentioned incidence, prevalence, burden of disease. So we can see the vaccination having directly, for example, an impact at the population level in terms of disease. Now, for surveillance, this is slightly different because surveillance, per definition, entails the collection of data and its analysis, which is then applied to interventions. And it's through this combination of better data applied to interventions that we actually generate our health outcome. And this is the benefit we will try to measure in our economic assessment. So conceptualizing how surveillance links to intervention is a key step. I would even argue the first step to identify benefits of surveillance, then to be able to identify costs. When we look at it from a One Health perspective, so we bring other sectors, we also need to see how this surveillance information is linking to intervention across sectors. We need to see, for example, if it's a zoonotic hazard that we're assessing, we need to see how is surveillance information generated in one sector, let's say in the animal health sector, contributing to interventions in other sectors, let's say public health. So health outcomes and benefits will always be linked to the application of information across different sectors. And this will really depend on the dynamics of the disease, whereas it's still, is it in the public health population, is it in the human population, is it in the environmental population, and also on the risk profile of the specific hazard. So I mentioned this already, there's this huge potential for surveillance in one sector to offer an early warning sign to other sectors. It's been the case with the West Nile virus surveillance system you've seen in Italy. It's very much the case to other emerging zoonoses. There's also the potential, even if the disease is already present across different sectors, that surveillance in one sector will inform interventions in other sectors. So it's the case, for example, for foodborne pathogens. We can see information coming from the animal population triggering interventions along the food chain. And we can also see that even if the information does not trigger directly an intervention, it will certainly enhance the understanding in other sectors. It will add and we will complete this puzzle of information that other sectors might be trying to put together. So it's also the case, for example, for antimicrobial resistance, as we try to understand better in the public health sector what is happening in the environment sector and the animal health sector as well. So one proposed step to be able to make sense of this is to start with a conceptual framework, to link surveillance to intervention to then derive health outcomes. And this is a conceptual framework we've proposed in 2016. It's slightly adapted, and basically you can see three different surveillance systems. When we see it in One Health, this information comes together. And we can see it triggering activities in the public health sector. I mentioned if it's early warning, if the disease is still not present in the human population, it could trigger preparedness activities, could trigger public health messaging, any rapid interventions. But it can also, even if disease is already in the human population, still inform policy and strategies, either at the human population level, such as vaccination, or for example, any interventions in terms of vector control and food chain. And from this application of information to these activities, we will have our health outcome and the benefit we want to measure, which will be a reduced burden of disease and cost of illness, in this case, in the public health sector. But from a One Health perspective, we also see this information being applied in the other sectors of this triads of human, animal, and ecosystems, also providing early warning, providing information for policy and strategies, and hence having this potential to reduce burden and direct and indirect impacts in the ecosystem and in our animals. Of course, again, from a One Health perspective, we know that after these effects will have a cascade effect on each other. And then I've mentioned this, this information can, even if not used directly for an intervention, can still enhance knowledge. What I mean is that information coming from across sectors can be used for integrated joint risk assessment, integrated, for example, contingency planning, for shaping research agendas, identifying data needs, or, for example, to conduct outbreak investigation. And all of that will have another benefit stream associated, very much linked with this intrinsic value of knowledge, but also value regarding to social capital and intellectual capital, all of which is very hard to measure, but are intermediate and intangible benefits. This is the benefit side, but actually, if we conceptualize things like that, we also start to have a bit more clarity on the costs of surveillance programs. And those will entail all labor, all expenses that go on all stages of the surveillance process. We're talking from the design to the implementation, even evaluation. It could be laboratory spending, or it could be any IT infrastructure needed to process the data. But then, of course, from a One Health perspective, we are actively integrating data from across sectors. So any costs that can be incurred through this also need to be considered. So it could be really simple, from organizing meetings to share data, analyze data. but it could be also a sophisticated IT database that is developed from scratch. And let's not forget, because we are seeing benefits of surveillance through its connections to integration, through its connections to intervention, we also need to see costs through that lens as well. So once we identified costs and benefits, we can actually follow the classical pathway to do an economic assessment. We start by identifying options for comparison and analytical perspective. So we might be considering whether a one-health surveillance system is economically beneficial versus a unisectorial, for example, only public health-based surveillance system. We identify costs and benefits following, for example, the conceptualization I just showed you. We then can quantify and value costs, and there's quite a lot of actually guidelines and practical examples in the literature on how to do so. We then quantify and value benefits. Here, we can capture these changes in population status through, for example, burden of disease assessments, using disability-adjusted life years if it's on the human side. We can look at cost of illness in humans or expenditure and losses due to animal disease. If we're looking at the animal side, we can use metrics such as the Z-DALI to combine human and animal expenditure together. Or we can want, if we are interested in seeing this intangible and other intermediate benefits, use more qualitative approaches or even stated preference methods and revealed preference methods. Now, all of these are very data intensive exercises, that I think as came across quite evidently also in Jonathan's presentation. And by the end, if we manage to complete all these steps, we can then apply our analytical tools for comparative analysis and end up with a cost-benefit analysis or a cost-effectiveness analysis or even a cost-utility analysis. So this is the theory, but I also wanted to show you some practical examples, and I've chose two examples coming from West Nile virus surveillance to tell different stories of how an economic assessment of a One Health surveillance system can result. So West Nile virus is a flavivirus that's currently endemic in Europe, particularly in south of Europe, also other regions of the world, including the United States and Canada. It has an enzootic amplification cycle by birds and mosquitoes. And then those mosquitoes can bridge the infection to mammals, most commonly humans, where it causes a range of symptoms from very mild flu-like illness to very severe encephalitis cases. And also it can be transmitted to horses. So really West Nile virus is a classical example of a threat that has a public health dimension, animal health dimension, certainly an ecosystems dimension too. Human-to-human transmission can occur particularly through blood transfusion and organ donation, and this is important for the example I'll be showing you after. So we take two surveillance systems quite different, both of them using a One Health approach to surveillance, to West Nile virus, and we try to do a full economic assessment to understand better their added value. And I'll start with the Emilia-Romagna example. I've already mentioned this, and if you want to see more about this, the specifics of this economic assessment, it has been published in +1, led by Julia Paternoster. And I'll briefly summarize. We've compared really a One Health system versus a unisectorial approach, very much based on public health surveillance triggering public health interventions. And we focused on the public health perspective in the sense that if you're looking at things through a One Health perspective, you can always try to measure costs and benefits across the spectrum of the interface. But of course, the more wider you do that assessment, the more data needs you required. So this specific analysis looked at benefits for public health. And we followed these steps I've already mentioned. We started by conceptualizing the links, and I'll show you that just in a minute. We identified cross-sectoral costs and benefits for both scenarios, the unisectorial and the One Health system. We then value costs, we value the benefit streams, and by the end, we manage to complete a cost-benefit analysis. And this is how the conceptualization looked like. So you can see the surveillance components on the left-hand side, and we try to see, okay, what exactly is this information triggering in all the sectors that are involved in this. And here you can see all the intervention components. One of them is triggering this blood donation screening. And I mentioned already before, this wild bird and horse surveillance, as well as the entomological surveillance, by the year of 2013, actually started to be the early warning trigger to start this blood donation screening. So it was not just seeing cases in human population, it was now detecting virus circulation in any population. And for the unisectoral scenario, costs considered were, so this was very much a public health-based approach with human surveillance, detection of cases in humans, so the cost of that human surveillance efforts, the cost of blood testing, this is the interventions the surveillance was triggering, the cost of communication campaigns and vector control interventions. For the One Health scenario, not only those costs were considered, but then we added veterinary surveillance, entomological surveillance costs, any linking of information, so the cost of holding meetings to share all of this information. And in terms of benefits of the One Health scenario, we considered any short-term cost of illness avoided due to this early warning, but also compensation for transfusion-associated diseases that were also avoided due to the early warning sign. And the results were very interesting. Not only what was really pivotal in this assessment is all these cost components, all the benefits, all the data pertaining to this were there, so it was possible to do it. And I think this really exemplifies well also what Jonathan, and links with what Jonathan was saying in his presentation about the need for surveillance to generate data also on costs. So this system in particular managed to capture all of that, which allows us then to evaluate it in economic terms. And we saw a cost saving, not only a cost saving in the period of analysis of 160,000 euros, but we actually saw quite large benefits. So not only there were 270,000 around that in avoided short-term cost of illness due to hospitalization, but there was also up to 2.7 million euros in avoided compensation to this. So this example remains a very good example of how it's possible to conduct a cost-benefit analysis if data is available, but also a very good example of how a One Health surveillance system actually has a very tangible added value. Now, the other example I wanted to bring today is the UK West Nile virus surveillance system. Now, it's very different because the West Nile virus One Health approach in the UK came about just following the initial reports of the virus in New York City in 1999. And the increased transmission of the virus in France. So the public health concerns surrounding the virus in the early 2000s in the UK started to increase. So it was decided to generate this West Nile virus task force that came together where public health professionals, animal health professionals, and also entomologists came together to share their findings. So surveillance efforts were intensified, contingency planning intensified in the country. There was a lot of initiatives surrounding awareness raising for clinicians, human clinicians and epidemiologists. There was enhanced testing for virus encephalitis in humans, but also routine passive surveillance in wild birds started, and some targeted entomological surveillance for mosquitoes. The disease in horses was already notifiable since the late 80s. Now, all these efforts were ramped up in the early 2000s. Since then, all surveillance streams up to date in the UK have yielded negative results. So there's no evidence of West Nile virus ever circulating in the UK. But we try to look back in time and see whether this concerted or One Health effort to look into West Nile virus had an added value. We started by conceptualizing the links between surveillance systems and the trigger interventions, as I've previously mentioned, and we did identify the cross-sectoral costs and benefits associated with surveillance. So we saw, for example, all of the surveillance information was triggering joint contingency planning. It was triggering research studies, but we weren't able actually to quantify. We did some preliminary assessment on costs and some preliminary assessments on benefits, but the data on costs and benefits was actually just not there. There was also a big time gap between the assessment and the implementation of the system. But again, the data gaps did not allow us to completely pinpoint nor the costs or the benefits. So again, another example of why we need to strengthen our surveillance systems to capture also this kind of data if at the end we want to assess the added value that they bring. But what was interesting, even though we did not manage to complete a full and neat cost-benefit analysis, as you've seen for Italy, what came out very interesting, it was this idea of an enhanced capacity, knowledge, and social capital. Because bear in mind, this was the early 2000s, and health professionals, animal health professionals, and entomologists were potentially for the very first time coming together across a table to share information. So there was a sense that the networks that were being established there were actually quite important, not only for surveillance, but eventually for any future control initiatives or any future hazards, which made us want to look more into this, what was happening, and go a little bit beyond just the cost effectiveness and cost benefit of a One Health surveillance system, and look into this intermediate and intangible benefits linked to not only the knowledge itself, but the fact that people were working together and sharing information and establishing these working relationships. So we ran a qualitative study on this perceived benefits of surveillance in this One Health context through some semi-structured interviews and framework analysis. And it was interesting to see that there were certainly positive perceptions and outcomes associated to One Health approaches to surveillance. An interesting point that came through was that people were very strongly positive about collaboration in the scope of One Health surveillance. When we talked about integration, there was this sense of a unique sort of animal health, human health, environmental health system, and some people had some reservations regarding that. So semantics also mattered in this context. Then there were certainly all the tangible benefits I mentioned until now, the potential to reduce burden were identified. Certainly sounder information for better risk assessment, leading to improved risk management, better policy decisions. But then these intangible benefits came out strongly again in this analysis. So people were describing this value of sounder information for their own baseline knowledge, for their technical reassurance, but also this generated as social capital and improved overall capacity for zoonosis. The fact that by designing a surveillance system, meeting colleagues across, say, for example, if you're an animal health practitioner, you get to know your colleagues from the public health side and the environmental side. Those are working connections that have social capital, and that could be actually capitalized in the future. So to conclude, the economic assessment of One Health surveillance does require a careful conceptualization of how benefit streams are derived, because they're not immediate, and how costs can be identified. And we need to see it, if we're talking about One Health surveillance, of course, across the human-animal ecosystems interface. And as we think about things in One Health, we tend to go more wider, more all-encompassing, of course, more holistic. But the more we do that, we need to be aware that the more data we need, and potential different set of tools are needed to quantify, evaluate different things. We potentially need also different sets of skills, not only animal health experts and economists and public health professional health economists, potentially other social scientists. So the wider collaboration is certainly going to be needed too. And all of these assessments are, of course, quite data intensive. Even if we're just focusing on one part of the triangle between public health, animal health, and in the environment. So there are certainly challenges related to the availability of data. Of course, modeling is a way around it, but there's also constraints, as we know, around modeling both costs and benefits. And I wanted to highlight also that there is this role when we talk about surveillance, when we talk about One Health initiatives, there could be this role of all these intangible and intermediate benefits that are really hard to quantify, but can be really key in contributing to overall added value. So they should not be underestimated as we start to run these assessments more widely. Now, there's plenty of opportunities, and then if you're considering starting such assessment, there's certainly starting points to frame the economic assessments. There's multiple tools available, not only from the public health side, but very interesting tools from the environmental side, and work to build upon. And this is the type of evidence that can be key, not only for One Health surveillance design and implementation, but also to influence wider policy changes on enhancing cross-sectoral work in the field of zoonoses and other health threats at the human-animal ecosystems interface. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you so much, obrigada. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions. Vitor, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for an excellent presentation. We'll proceed now with discussion, and I invite Professor Silvia Miranda from CEPEA at the University of São Paulo. First, I think Silvia will present herself and give a brief overview of the kind of work on the economics of animal health they've been doing there at their group. And then she'll introduce the discussion and we'll take it from there. So Silvia, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vitor. Good morning, everyone. I am very pleased and honored to have the opportunity to moderate this session. And I would like to start my participation making a couple of comments about the subject and also about the kind of work my research team has been working on in the last years in CEPEA. CEPEA is the Center of Research in Applied Economics from ESALC. ESALC is the College of Agriculture of University of São Paulo in Piracicaba, São Paulo State. And at CEPEA, we have been developing some studies on economic evaluation of sanitary and phytosanitary programs, and sometimes evaluating impacts of pests and diseases, and also pests and diseases that we still do not have in Brazil. Of course, our focus has been in Brazilian interests. I am an agronomist, an agronomic engineering, and my PhD is in applied economics. And I think it's interesting to comment that my main area of research has been international trade, and particularly non-tariff barriers, sanitary, technical, environmental barriers to trade. And in the last, I would say, 15 years, people from private and public sector have come to me and asked me economic evaluation on sanitary programs. And in a different way, I have been working until then. And this particular way would be trying to see the problems from the perspective of import of sanitary and food safety measures to protect our country, instead of taking a look and analyzing the problems from the point of view of an exporting country. But actually, the two issues, the 2 points of views are very much connected. Well, going back to CEPEA, as I mentioned, since 2008, we have been developing studies, both in collaboration with public sector and also private sector. And until now, we had the opportunity to evaluate some of the main programs, official programs we have in Brazil. The kind of research we are conducting as being usually on demand from the government and from some of international institutions like IDB and IICA. Because of that, we have been producing some reports, and these reports are not always made public. But anyway, my point here is to tell you that in Brazil, this kind of study of economic evaluation of diseases, either for plants or animal, are not very common, and we face some challenges I would like to point now. Well, despite the scarcity and sometimes poor status of databases available, from what we have done so far, we can affirm that having any studies on about economics of animal diseases to support public and private strategies is better than having nothing and no information and no evaluation about this issue. Dr. Rushton has commented in his final slides about the relevance of this information to provide information for public policy. And actually that's the point. More and more in Brazil, policymakers are becoming sensitive to the economic impacts of diseases and of sanitary and phytosanitary programs. And so, despite all the difficulties and all the scarcity of database and all the scarcity of studies, we still believe that having some data, some information, some modeling, even though they are sometimes poor, very restricted in terms of scope, it is still more interesting than having nothing to discuss. Of course, I always tell my researchers, it's important to be very cautious when we take these numbers, these figures, the outcomes of our math modeling. And we have to be very cautious because we use this information, these outcomes, to discuss policy, but they should not be considered as the true values or the most important elements to consider. We have to put together these outcomes from our economic models with other information we have in order to provide a better support for policymakers and also for private companies as well. Well, what I could trying to summarize the kind of results we found. What was interesting in analyzing the studies, in analyzing the sanitary programs in Brazil is that today we can affirm that when we compare, for example, the preventive policies for zoonoses, and we compare the results the benefit cost ratios or the economic impacts, when we compare those with other programs that are more focused on controlling diseases and pests in Brazil, we can affirm that investments in prevention, either in prevention to diseases dissemination or to prevent new diseases to enter in Brazil, is a very economically efficient way to expend money. I would say that the policies to prevent dissemination or entrance of new diseases are economically very advantageous for the country. Even though we cannot measure, we cannot evaluate all the costs and all the benefits, even though we do not have very good baselines to work on, and even more difficulties to project different scenarios. And so we have found large benefit cost ratios, and we have been trying to analyze them, not as absolute numbers and figures, but comparing a long time, comparing among different programs. Just to give you an example, we had opportunity to analyze the avian influenza program, a program that tried to prevent the entrance of avian influenza in Brazil. We have been analyzing also the foot and mouth disease program, and even the last big change in the program when we decided to start quitting the vaccination. We had a lot of analysis on this program, and we built some scenarios. We also analyzed the brucellosis and the tuberculosis program, official program in Brazil. And more recently, we have been working, evaluating the status of the national program of equids health in Brazil. And of course, when we compare studies, we can develop related to bovines disease compared to, for example, equines, horses diseases. It's much more easier to work with bovines diseases, of course, because we have better database on bovines sanitary issues, and also on bovines as an economic sector for Brazil. So because of this caveats in the databases, not only the economic databases, but also the epidemiological databases, the scarcity of some studies in veterinarian, from the veterinarian areas, for example, trying to identify the losses of productivity that horses or bovines face when they are sick. Despite all this scarcity of information, we still can develop some analysis, and we can try to interpret and to help policymakers to take better decisions. And it's also worth mentioning that the studies we have been developing about risk analysis of imports in the airports, particularly in the airports. I think it's interesting to comment that we have at CEPEA, we had access to information from airports and cargoes coming from airports, and the kind of non-compliance some of these cargoes had. And this provided us a very interesting database to work better with risk analysis using artificial intelligence tools. And so we are quite sure that if we have access, a broader access to this kind of information, the university, the academia could help much better the policymakers in making new designs of risk assessment and risk management tools in order to provide not only more efficiency in terms of the control of sanitary and phytosanitary issues, but also more efficiency in terms of managing resources that we have. Everybody knows in Brazil that little by little we face reduction in our budgets, in having and contracting and employment of more people in this area, in the public sector. So we have to work better with artificial intelligence, with databases, in order to take advantage of the risk analysis tools we already know, but that we are not really being applied in a broad way in Brazil, not yet. We are moving forward in this field, but I believe from my experience that we can improve a lot the kind of study, the advantage of using this kind of information that usually are are with the public sector, but we also have difficulties sometimes to get access to private databases that would be very helpful to improve the kind of study we have been discussing this morning. I also would like I can assure, considering also our experience, is that the epidemiologists and governmental agencies might provide more detailed information on the status of diseases and programs, and their projections on evolution for the following years. If we could have that, agricultural economists like me, we could advance more quickly in applying these tools I have commented about. Speaking a little bit more on what I consider the greatest challenge in order to move forward in this field of research in Brazil, I would like to add some points about the database relevance. Professor Rushton highlighted that we have to get a baseline in order to work on this kind of studies. And I would say that in Brazil, before discussing the baseline, we still have a lot of challenges to establish, to have a picture, a more effective and real picture of the current status of the sanitary situation for several sectors and for several diseases and past situation in Brazil. So how can we even know the kind of information we would like to have in a database if we cannot collect, or we cannot really have a real picture of the status of the sanitary problems we have? So, and then the challenge is not only in terms of databases on epidemiological information, but also the challenges we face in order to have information on public costs to run the official programs. It was also mentioned before the complexity of the production systems in Brazil, but we also have to deal with the complexity of having 27 states. And so we have, of course, the federal programs as general programs, general rules, establishing general rules in terms of sanitary programs in Brazil. But then we have 27 states with some room to implement the sanitary, animal health programs. And so we need not only information about the costs of official programs in terms of federal budget, but we also have to get information about the costs for states to run the animal health programs. And in addition to this particular challenge in terms of economic information, we also have a huge heterogeneity in terms of prevalence, incidence of diseases, and we very often, when we start analyzing a disease like brucellosis, for example, and we need, as economists, we need to know what is the prevalence of the disease in Brazil, in the different states. We have to get this information, even to try, not only to try to build the baseline, the epidemiological baseline, but also in order to establish the different scenarios and what could be if we had different ways and policies to interfere in that baseline. So we face challenges as agricultural economists to get information from the epidemiology, and sometimes we get information for one state that is more recent, but then we how to compare and how to discuss a policy, a general policy, if for other states we have an older information about the prevalence or the incidence of those diseases. So this is the kind of reality we face, and in terms of economic databases and also epidemiological databases. So so besides the individual information, another difficulty we faced in the last 15 years to deal with this kind of study is that sometimes we do not need not only the individual information, but we would need that this information coming from 27 states, it should be integrated, harmonized. And so why am I commenting about these challenges? Because, again, in order to build a baseline, in order to build different scenarios of intervention, in order to discuss the economic impacts or the economic importance of having a surveillance system, One Health system, we need to establish the basic scenario, and the basic scenario is to define what is the current status in terms of economic and in terms of epidemiological aspects, and then we can move forward to establish the baseline and to establish scenarios, alternative scenarios. Finally, what I would like, my last point before going to the discussion, what I would like to emphasize is that despite the fact that all of us, we would like to get this benefit cost ratios, or even the results of a cost effectiveness analysis. It's very important. That's the way, that's the kind of language that policymakers, that the Minister of Finance that the secretaries of state, of finance secretary of states, that's the kind of information they love, and to make their points and to take their solutions and their resolutions. Despite of that, we in the case of Brazil, I think we still could broad the analysis, adopting the what we call a framework that is very that's well known in Europe, for example, in the United States. That is the framework we call regulatory impact analysis. The regulatory impact analysis is a broad. Actually, first of all, it's a transparency tool to help policymakers. When we have a policy that has a potential to impact the economy, the society, trade, or the public sector, we should. That's what the regulatory impact analysis assumes. We should apply this kind of analysis, and this analysis comprises the regulatory framework, what kind of law and resolutions and regulation we have, what kind of regulation we have abroad, what is the problem we are analyzing, what is the goal, what is the target of the policy. When I discuss, for example, brucellosis or foot and mouth disease or avian influenza, what is the target, what is the goal we have with this policy? As official agencies, what should be pursued when we decided to intervene, to interfere, and to establish a program or to change a sanitary program? So this is the first point that we have to address when we are applying this broad framework, regulatory impact analysis. And then we have to keep making questions like, what are the alternatives? Should the government interfere in this program, in this sector? Should the government adopt a new program? Should the government agencies change the current program? And then after that, we have to start making questions like, what kind of benefits and costs each of the alternative interventions could provoke in the economy? Who would be the agents most affected in each one of the scenarios of alternative policies? And then finally, after we have this broad diagnosis, we move to the quantitative analysis. Whenever we can, whenever we have data to take this step of trying to quantify and to evaluate the impacts, and then compare different policy alternatives. But I got a very important lesson from an expert from DEFRA from England. When I first started working with the regulatory impact analysis, and England was a pioneer in applying and adopting the regulatory impact analysis, also for agricultural policy, environmental policy, and so on. And he used it to tell me, Sylvia, the numbers, the benefit cost ratios are very interesting, and they have this appeal for policymakers. But if you do not have good numbers, and even you do, you should always consider all the qualitative aspects that probably you have not measured, you have not evaluated, but they could be as important as the quantitative results you got from your economic analysis. And so I think that of course, the focus here was a more economic discussion, but I would like to emphasize as a final message that it's very important to adopt this broader framework of regulatory impact analysis. And little by little, as the databases improve, as we got more integration between academia and policymakers and private sectors, then we can improve our quantification in economic analysis. But while we do not have this utopia, I would say that so far it's almost an utopia. I would say that we should keep working, but we should not minimize the relevance of qualitative aspects in this kind of evaluation we have been discussing this morning. So that were my first comments. I would like also to say that both presentations were very interesting, and I am sure that now we can advance in discussion, taking some questions from the audience. Vitor, I don't know if you have.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. So Sylvia, we have one single question from the audience. It's very specific, so I would like to leave it to a later stage. I have a couple of points and questions I would like to raise to the speakers. But do you have any specific question before I actually go ahead?
I have some other comments about specific topics I thought particularly interesting, but if you can start, if you want to start, we could start with your comments, then I would like to add.
So first for Jonathan, about the animal, how do you call it, the health loss envelope, right?
Yeah.
So you said you start that by having a utopia, a baseline and an utopia scenario. Mm-hmm. That would be like the perfect kind of situation without any disease. And then you start with attribution. How do you deal with the fact that many diseases are production diseases, endemic diseases that actually the impact is very clear in affecting production, because we're talking about herd level, right? So they affect production, whereas other diseases, they might actually just kill the animals in a few days. And most of the diseases that either kill animals or lead to killing the animals, because you can't live with them, and because they're trade-related diseases, they are object to surveillance systems. So in case of an introduction, there would be an immediate reaction and animals would be killed anyway, even before getting sick. So we have different types of diseases that affect production in very different ways. And also, I'll just merge two questions into one, because it's all about this animal health envelope. These kind of diseases I'm talking about, like avian influenza, for example, or even classical swine fever in free areas or advanced eradication areas. The impact is not necessarily so much in production. That's very clear for FMD, for example, but it's the immediate impact on trade. So what's going to affect producer himself, so the farmer, is not so much the fact that he's living with disease and that has an impact on that lowers milk production or beef production or low fertility or whatever. is the fact that if that disease is present in that region, you wouldn't be able to sell its produce, and you would be immediately affected because of trade, because it's mostly a trade issue, right? So we have, it's not, when I look at the scheme, it's not very clear to me how you're actually going about this.
So let me go back to how the UK handled what you described. They slaughtered a lot of animals. I think it was something like 500,000 cattle and nearly 5 million sheep during the period of the FOD crisis. A large proportion of those animals were not slaughtered because they were actually either in the infected zones. They were actually slaughtered because of welfare issues. So therefore, it would be captured in the sense of the individual jurisdiction, their removal of those animals in terms of actually sort of taking them out of the activity. So it would actually be a kind of reduction of the market and a replacement of that simply by culling the animals and taking them out of the piece. So from a very practical perspective, we could capture, even within the animal health loss envelope, that kind of reaction to removing those animals through a kind of preventive or even a kind of control type measure. So there's, in some respects, Vitor, there's less need to actually even think about the production losses that you've just described with regards impacts on production, etc. Once you've estimated that, then we can sort of start to calculate the change of efficiency, which would then feed into what you're describing with regards access to international markets. So it's our intention to actually link that kind of household or farm level assessments, or even kind of wider population issues, both to national models but also to global models with regards how the trade impacts actually shift. Again, if you take the example of the kind of shifts we've seen in the recent past, for example, the appearance of a single case of BSE in the US back in the 1990s, I think, actually led to a shift of trade from the US into Australia, and has never been changed again. So the burden of diseases shifts from one place to another. So we end up with the US losing a trade, and actually possibly Australia increasing its population grouping and actually shifting potentially the global burden of disease into another space because of that trade impact issue. Have we worked out all the mechanisms for that, Vitor? No. I hold up my hand and say, no, we've not done that yet. I think the other one that I would say, which I think is quite important, and one we're sort of thinking about at the moment, is the occurrence of African swine fever in Asia, where we are seeing obviously a massive shift in the pig sector in Asia, but a reaction from the farming sector where their feed resources are being moved potentially into the poultry sector and to some extent into the aquatics. So as the pigs disappear because of one disease, other animals start to fill the gap because they're resilient and resistant to that disease, and start to supply the market with a slightly different product. So while we lose one sector, we start to gain in another, and the burdens of disease sort of shift across those pieces. Now, it's complicated, but then imagine if you're in the Minister of Agriculture actually trying to make decisions about where the efficiencies of your livestock sector lie and which species mixes should you have to actually guarantee food to your populations. And I think that's the kind of mentality we have to think about. How do we best allocate scarce, concentrate feed resources to actually get the best out of our livestock systems and get the best resilience and variations across that? I know I haven't answered your question, but those are the kinds of things we're thinking about. Vitor, while I've got the floor, I just want to respond quickly to Sylvia's comment. When I talk about baselines, I'm thinking very much about what is the current levels of acceptable disease or impact of diseases that we're currently living with, and what would happen if we actually remove that. So what is that gap? And what efficiencies are we creating by accepting certain levels of disease? And to focus minds a little bit on what can we do in the future to actually make a difference and improve that efficiency issue? So Vito, I hope that kind of half answers your question, but we're working on it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in fact, I would like to pick up on what you've just said about the baselines to link to the second question, and I'll actually sort of merge the question from the audience with this one because I think it's related. The question from the audience, from Mariana, was how can we define a threshold to determine if a program is cost effective or not, right? And the relationship of this to my question is that as you know, we've over the last 3 days we've been focusing on bat-transmitted rabies and how does that impact how we run the surveillance system in cattle, in bats, and of course there's the human side. So this is actually a question for both of you, right? So it's not just for Jonathan, because this is like almost the perfect One Health issue. And in fact, it does have a One Health dimension. And it's very interesting to understand the challenges and the bottlenecks to actually make it work as a One Health issue. And the key issue that is actually most people are very passionate about it, is that traditionally the veterinary professionals have dealt with these with a very aggressive strategy for basically killing bats, right? Vampire bats. So, and this is actually not only the way it's been done over the years, it's not necessarily very effective in terms of reducing risk for production animals and for people, but it's also potentially harmful in environmental terms, right? So it's a typical One Health issue. And yesterday in our closed meeting with the focal points in the States, one from the Federal District, who also happens to be now a graduate student of mine, but he's dealing with this program. He raised a very interesting point, because he said, look, here the Federal District is a very small area, just with less than 100,000 cattle, which in Brazil is amounts to nothing, and almost all of it in very small farms with 3, 5, 6 cattle each, right? A 15 cattle farm in the Federal District is a big one, right? So that's the scenario, and it has a well-structured veterinary public veterinary system, surveillance system, and they're trying to do really good work. And so they said, well, since 2010, we improved the surveillance activities, both in responding to signs of bat aggression to cattle, and then trying to find bat roosts and do some population control there. And then, whereas for larger states, it's very difficult and very cost ineffective, so to speak, to think about blanket vaccination schemes, like vaccinating the whole population all the time, because there's no risk justification for that. In the Federal District, it's small, and so they ended up with having cattle vaccination every year. So this started in 2010, not 2010. It improved in 2010, but it was triggered by the fact that a region that had been free of rabies historically in 2003, if I'm not wrong, had outbreaks of rabies. So rabies came into the region. And so that's where it all started. So now with this strategy, there's very few rabies cases, just sporadic rabies cases. So it's, in a way, it's a success, right? So they actually managed to prevent rabies. They managed to prevent rabies. They have almost no cases in cattle. They run the surveillance system. There's preventive vaccination, and it seems to be fine. But then there's a question: one is what's the cost-benefit ratio of these, or is this effective? And we don't know how much rabies we're actually, and especially, should we keep vaccinating every year? Because it's the farmer pays for the vaccine, right? So for how long should we keep vaccinating? But it's very difficult to attribute a rabies risk since the measures are in place, and so rabies became just a sporadic problem in the region. But rabies is endemic in the country, but doesn't happen in an endemic stability like a disease like brucellosis or TB, right? You all know that. So it happens in epidemic outbursts. And so we don't really know if we do nothing, again, would we have rabies, or should we just do nothing and wait for rabies to occur? Because, the decision makers may at some point ask, do we need to do this public and private investment in vaccine? So from looking at this from an economic point of view, it's not very easy, because as Mariana said in a question, what would be the measure? I think that's what she meant, the measure to determine if the program is cost effective or not, like having no cases, but what would be the baseline scenario without the intervention in a disease like this? And just to make it short now, rabies is a very interesting example, but in a way, this is the kind of question that's coming up for most public surveillance efforts in an exporting country like Brazil, because most of the veterinary service is now dealing with surveillance of diseases that aren't here, like that have been eradicated, like foot and mouth disease, avian influenza, classical swine fever in most of the country, and so on. And so then people need to know, until when should I have an investment in pathogen-specific surveillance? If I haven't had an outbreak of classical swine fever, for example, for 30 years, most of the states focus their surveillance of CSF, of swine surveillance in CSF, despite the fact that it's been 30 years since the last break occurred. They could actually be considered now by the OIE historically free. And so from the point of view of the OIE, they wouldn't need to have specific surveillance for CSF, just general surveillance for that particular production system, right? But then when you look at the economics of that, in that case, it's all about trade. Because you stop doing surveillance for CSF, and then the countries who are buying pork from Brazil will say, I won't buy pork because they don't have surveillance for CSF, right? So they keep doing it. We've had this discussion on and on. They keep doing it, not because they really have a risk of CSF, but because the buyers want you to do surveillance for CSF. But in a situation like rabies, it's actually more interesting from an epidemiological point of view, because it's a real problem. It's still there, but it doesn't happen on a stable manner. So you don't really know until when you need to keep on doing this and spend money and direct your investments to the kind of interventions that are going on at the moment, right? So it's just a general issue. And in a way, just to finalize my comments, in a way, I also would like Jonathan to comment on how if an approach like the GBAD approach and the animal health envelope approach would actually proceed and provide all these information you're aiming at, whether this would actually provide a new framework for looking at these problems. Maybe I'm just, it's probably an utopia, this is probably an utopia scenario, but maybe if you'd have these a proper framework for looking at these things in its economic perspective, maybe it would be easier to decide on these kind of things. But let's down to earth, and so I would appreciate if you could provide some inputs and some comments on this. I'm also bringing rabies to the discussion, not only because it's an interesting example, but because I know a lot of people in the audience are particularly interested in rabies, but we don't really need to focus just on rabies, right? Just to make it clear. Okay.
So I'll make a comment, but I think Sarah, maybe you want to talk about perhaps Z-DALIs in a minute. That would be good. Yeah, I think Vitor, Brazil's not the only country that keeps doing things over and over again, even though there's no disease. So the UK spends, I think, about £500,000 or £1 million a year checking for trichinella in pigs. Mm-hmm. We haven't had trichinella in pigs for, I think, 60 or 70 years. I'm in danger with getting these things wrong, but I know it's a recurring problem, being told that you have to keep doing something, even though it doesn't sort of make any sense.
Yeah, it's same here.
And I think that what I would like to see in the future is that we actually take a perspective of the health and welfare of the animal, and we understand a little bit better about which are the major diseases that are problematic, whether we've got nutrition and water issues, whether we've got injuries and accidents and predation issues. Now, can you tell me in the last year how many cattle you lost because of flooding and drought or nutritional problems in Brazil? I suspect not.
No, I don't think so.
Look at a country like Australia that in the last 5 years has probably lost hundreds of thousands of cattle because of flooding, hundreds of thousands of sheep because of drought. Are those issues more important than the infectious disease burdens or even the production disease issues? And what are we actually doing about it to actually make a difference to the health and well-being of the animals that we're taking care of? So I think providing some data around that and sort of showing people that there is certain losses and certain welfare issues associated with health problems that we're creating to the animals that should be thought about more carefully, both from a societal perspective and an individual farmer perspective, becomes important. And I say that from the perspective of how the Institute of Health Metrics have put out data on human health. So if you look at their data, there's been an increasing recognition of the importance of non-communicable diseases as well as the infectious disease burdens. And through that process, a lot of health policy, human health policy, has started to change towards thinking more carefully about non-communicable diseases as well as infectious disease issues. So it's by providing those rich data sets that we can start to actually allow people to see more carefully where we might want to focus those problems. On the issue you raised with rabies, should we keep doing something? And again, I'd say same kind of boom and bust problems we have in the UK. So we had a big foot and mouth disease outbreak in 1967-68. We had a very minor one, I think, in 1981, and then we had another big one in 2001. Between those big outbreaks, we had an increase in surveillance and activity of the animal health system that waned because of the institutional memory loss. And the point that Sarah raised, that it's the intangible things of the memories of people about how serious these problems are that keep that going. But as soon as you start to lose staff who've got that institutional memory, then people start to relax. So when we had foot and mouth disease diagnosed in 2001, people didn't recognize it. It was picked up quite slowly. People didn't understand the dangers of animal movement, and we had a big outbreak. So how do you stop that? Vito, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, we run simulation activities to try and improve our awareness, our response to things. You're about to go into that unpleasant area where you're going to start dropping vaccination across different parts of the country for foot and mouth disease. And it's no good just having a dropping vaccination policy. You need to have a change of attitude on surveillance. And it's not just about checking for FMD, it's about checking for the health and welfare of your animals to make sure that FMD becomes better detected, I think. So it's a shift of attitude towards thinking about which things we're looking at in terms of problems. And then just on the very specific point with the cost effectiveness analysis, in human health, there are pretty straightforward guidelines from the World Bank that if you're doing cost effectiveness analysis, then I think it's 3 times GDP, 3 or 4 times GDP per disability adjusted life year avoided. Okay, so those are the guidelines. If you're doing cost benefit analysis, which is what you should be doing if you're doing livestock assessments, because we can put money numbers on most things, then it's the acceptable rate of return. So the internal rate of return, or it's positive net present value that we're searching for. But it depends a little bit. I mean, Sarah's touched on the issues that you can't really measure that you might want to include. But Sarah, do you want to talk a bit about the Z-DALI? Because I think that's also one approach with regards to thinking about the kind of zoonoses.
Sure, because I mentioned really quickly in my presentation this concept of Z-DALI, which is a metric that is actually recently developed by Paul Torgerson and colleagues, including Jonathan. And the idea is that we finally actually have a metric that allows us to capture both the impact in humans in terms of disability adjusted life years, so mortality and morbidity, plus the impact of what that disease might be having in animals as well, which we normally capture in monetary terms. But what the author suggests is a conversion into a metric called the ALE, and then we can add ALEs with DALIs, and we get a non-monetary metric that captures the effects of certain diseases, zoonoses or not, in the two populations. So for example, in my current work, I'm actually applying Z-DALIs to the effect of snake bites in both humans and in livestock. And by doing so, I'm also trying to capture cost of illness. By doing so, doing a comprehensive assessment of what it might mean for both the health of animals in terms of economic impact, but also for the health of populations. So combining those two. So it's a very useful metric to measure this. And I just wanted to add on the point of rabies surveillance. Again, it's, of course, it has the animal health dimension, but being a zoonosis, and I think it's Professor Ricardo Dias that does this point on the chat, being a surveillance, there's certainly a public health, being a zoonosis, there's certainly a public health link. So when we see it, and if we're gonna look at it in terms of, is it really an added value to continue such program? I would argue very much from a One Health perspective that we need to put all these potential benefits, and they need to be conceptualized and see if they're there, on the balance as well.
I believe Sylvia has some points too.
Yes, and thank you. I would like to hear Sarah and also Jonathan thinking about two points. Actually, in the studies we have been developing for Brazil, two things caught my attention. The first one is, for example, in the study for food and mouth disease program, we in analyzing the scenarios, and even in the current system, it was necessary, at least we realized that, to consider a failure rate in terms of the surveillance system, the official surveillance system. I would say, for example, just to give you a very specific example, we have a large frontier with other countries in South America, and so we know that it's a huge task to monitor this frontier. And of course, we are subjected to failure in this surveillance system. And so I would like to know, in the cases you have already analyzed for other countries, how did you manage that? Was this also a problem for you in modeling? And a second question is that I can tell. Yesterday I was in a meeting discussing a certain animal issue, and people were saying, okay, we have this different comprehension, different understanding from farmers in different regions about the relevance of the sanitary problem, the particular sanitary program. And many people say, okay, there is a regulation, so we cannot consider asymmetry of information and the kind of impacts this no consciousness about the policy. But actually, when we consider Brazil, we see that there are many farmers, many people directly impacted by the policy, that they do not realize, they do not really know about the program, how they get impacted from that. They only know that sometimes they face costs, and they are angry about facing these costs. For example, costs with tests and of blood for animals. But we also know that many of them, they do not know actually the sanitary policy they should be following. And so how have you dealt with this kind of situation, or this is not a real situation in the cases you have been working on? These are the 2 points I would like to hear from you.
So Sylvia, hands up. We have not yet got to a point where I can give you any information about how we're going to handle trade between countries that you're describing, where you've got movement patterns, possibly of breeding stock, probably more like the animals that are coming into fattening units. I've done little bits of work around that kind of issue where there's trade between Mexico and the United States, different changes of movement patterns with things like TB control between Mexico and the US. It's problematic. If you look at the way the US have handled that, particularly after the BSE outbreak in Canada that led to whole changes of cattle movement out of Mexico because of the closure of borders between Canada and the US. The US has simply imposed its own kind of categorization of the populations in Mexico. And it's totally ignored the Mexican way of actually classifying tuberculosis in that sense. So being very heavy-handed and being a big country, it was able to do that. I'm not suggesting you do the same thing, but I suppose it's one way to sort of guarantee your borders and guarantee your kind of sanitary status. So it's difficult to apply. It's a long time since I've been in Bolivia, but I have been to the borders between Brazil and Bolivia, and I know that it's not an easy place to police. So how you control those movements, I think, is quite hard. I'm trying to think the other point you raised at the end. Maybe I'll ask Sarah to pick up on that. Sarah, do you want to chip in?
Yes, I can also. I'm not sure if this is very useful either, Sylvia, but from the experience on the examples and the assessment that I've carried and that I've seen in the literature, they're very much public spending based programs. where the farmers don't actually incur in direct costs or out-of-pocket expenditure. So when assessing the sort of cost-benefit analysis of those programs, I would say it's not a question that I've encountered yet, in terms of, certainly for more the impact of disease from the human side, there's certainly sort of out-of-pocket expenditure that come into the equation. And it will be the same for animal diseases, but I have not had the experience yet of assessing a disease to which it was the farmer's contribution paying towards, for example, surveillance costs or interventions that were mostly public health based. So I haven't dealt with that yet. But also on your first point, and just to build up on that regarding failure rate for surveillance for a variety of reasons regarding that. Again, I can only see it. The example I showed you, for example, West Nile virus in Italy, it was a retrospective study, and it was very easy to identify that the surveillance systems were actually picking up with a lot of sensitivity the cases. And if that's the case, then the analysis is relatively simple, I would say, if you have the data there. But moving forward, if you need to model the sensitivity of the surveillance system, then certainly you need to enter into modeling exercises to see really how much it's picking up, and it could be for a variety of reasons, including cross-border issues.
And actually, for some studies and some cases, it's very determinant of to compare scenarios, because if you consider there's a 100% of successful actions, it's okay. But if you have the probability of having a failure, this really could affect the interpretation and of those results, right? Okay, I also think interesting to comment. In Brazil, usually the diseases. Now, I told you we had the opportunity to analyze brucellosis and tuberculosis program, and when we compare the situation with the foot and mouth disease that affect, and that's effectively something that impacts the international trade competitiveness, we can see the relevance of measuring impacts over the image of the country. I would say that it's interesting. Sometimes I was talking to fruit farmers from the northeast of Brazil, and they would say, okay, our fruits exports depend on the sanitary status of bovines, foot and mouth disease, because people in other countries, very often they want to know, they need the certification that foot and mouth disease status for Brazil, because, and I asked them why it should be like that, and they said, okay, if Brazil is being successful in guaranteeing this status in foot and mouth disease, then we consider that Brazil is able to provide, is entitled to provide fruits, because then we can trust in the phytosanitary system. So I would like to know how deep you usually go in your analysis to consider, to include this kind of intangible impact, not so intangible, but I would say it's intangible if you think how to measure impacts on the image and all the spillovers that this kind of impact, this image could have for other sectors. Do you have an experience in going deeper in this topic?
No. I mean, it's something that I would talk about in talks. I haven't seen anybody try to actually estimate the value of it. It's something that I would argue that, if you look at Latin America and its ability to have invested over the last 50 years very strongly in the animal health system and actually control diseases, that's been a big part of its success in the international agricultural markets. I wonder, just throwing this back to you, Sylvie, a little bit, is that as the world continues to change, we've recently done some work on the dropping of foot and mouth disease vaccination in Uruguay. One thing that surprised me, having been away from the continent for quite a while, was the real shift of trade from Europe to China, and probably the different attitudes that we take to these phytosanitary and sanitary issues in your key markets. So potentially, as the world moves forward, it may be that some of the things that we've been worried about for the last 50 years start to shift a little bit because of the impressions and the abilities of different countries to cope with the kinds of things we're talking about here. So, you know, if there is a problem with something like foot and mouth disease in the future in the South American region, how will China approach that? How strict will it be about importation of your products into the Chinese market when they're heavily dependent on your region to make sure that they can feed their people in urban spaces? So that's one of the questions I think which is probably going to be quite important as we move forward, because the growing populations of the world are not in Europe anymore. It's in Africa and Asia, and their attitudes to sanitary and phytosanitary status potentially will be quite different. So I think that's one of the things we should probably be thinking about. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't control diseases, because I think there are other arguments to it, but maybe the trade patterns will be a little bit different because of that.
Yeah, can I make a comment? Yeah, you're absolutely right, and the same thing happens in Brazil, I think even more than Uruguay. And it's, at the moment, it's not so much the impact on disease, on the focus on diseases, because these new markets, like especially China, they're also focusing on diseases, but it has an impact on other things. For example, about 1-2 years ago, I was starting to discuss antimicrobial resistance surveillance with the swine industry at the highest level, with the private sector, and they're obviously aware of that and working on it, but they didn't want to focus so much on that. They didn't feel the pressure, because if you look at the discussion about this in the international scenario, it seems like antimicrobial resistance is the only thing that matters now, is the key issue. But it's probably not the key issue for the Chinese, right? So it's not a key issue to export pork to China, where the African swine, or to Asia, where African swine fever is actually increasing the demand for pork. So you have a window of opportunity at the moment where countries like Brazil really not only can, but need to export even more pork to China and other Asian countries. And one of the problems with controlling antimicrobial resistance here is actually changing a bit the structure of the production, the whole production system, not at the farm level, because it's a 3-tier production system, highly integrated. So you don't do all the stages in one single farm. And that has implications for the only way you can manage getting all these piglets from different farms into one farm where they will be part of their life is using a lot of antibiotics. When all these pigs come together in one place, you start giving antibiotics to these pigs, right? You need to actually do this, to use less heavily antibiotics. You need to change the production system. But they're not going to do that in a moment when the pressure is to produce more, not to produce less. So the flaws of the production system are actually, in terms of antimicrobial resistance, tend to be aggravated at the moment, right? Because it's all trade related. So, and nobody will change that in the short term. it's probably going to be a big issue in the long term. In the short term, the market is different. So I wanted to raise a last question, at least from my side, is that Jonathan mentioned the shift from the FMD program, shifting from, and this is a major change, shifting from vaccination to surveillance, right? There's always been surveillance, but as you start withdrawing vaccination, and this process already started, and it will go on for the next 4 or 5 years until the whole country is free without vaccination. The focus is now on surveillance, but there's two problems here. One, actually, they're both related. One is vaccination was regulated by the public sector, but paid by the private sector. So it was viewed and accepted, and it worked when it was considered a private good, not a public good, which it is, of course. Now surveillance has a fundamental economic issue here. Surveillance is viewed as a public good, and so when you see it's a public good, and the OIE says this all the time, then people expect the public sector to actually fund it, right? Of course, Brazil has many ways of going about this problem, but the problem is there, right? How do you see this? And from an economic point of view, how do you think a country can sort of go about this problem? And I'll just leave one note here, because you also addressed it, and Sylvia as well, is that I think there's a fundamental flaw here in the way it's correct to think about surveillance as a prerequisite to actually withdraw vaccination, and that's the plan. But I think it's bound to fail in the medium term, because it's focused on FMD surveillance, and if things go well, FMD will rapidly become an intangible issue, right? Okay, there's trade, but there's no FMD there for 10 years, 15 years, whatever, right? And it happened everywhere. It happened in Argentina when they withdrew vaccination 20 years ago, right? So I think this is not about economics. One way of going about this problem would be to shift the focus of surveillance also to more tangible problems like brucellosis, TB, rabies, and other things. And the same goes for swine and poultry, and not focusing just on the trade diseases that have been eradicated. So keep the tangible thing as part of your surveillance. Otherwise, it's very difficult to maintain adequate public investment in surveillance. But I don't think this is the only answer to the problem and the only dimension of this problem. So I would like to think, what's your view on this?
Sarah, do you want to?
I link this again, Vitória, to one health surveillance, and in my presentation, when we started to think how to think about the added value of surveillance, of course, you need to think about all the ramifications of impact and why you are doing surveillance for a certain disease. I thought it was really interesting the point Sylvia made about this kind of side impact of the animal disease into actually plant health and the implications of that, because we're not always able to understand all the ramifications of impact. And by not understanding all the ramifications of impact, when we think about the effects of surveillance, we might also be missing really important parts of it. So I go back to the sort of the original or the basis on which I built my intervention previously, which is we understand the impact first, and then by that we understand better why we're doing things. Why are we doing surveillance? To then understand interventions. But there's always, particularly for zoonoses, and I'll stick to the zoonosis side of it, there's also always these multiple ramifications. So we should try to be as inclusive as possible. Of course, and we use that term already, it's very utopic because the demand of data for that and trying to make sure we understand all the ramifications of impact and potentially effective of surveillance might be realistic, but that would be the utopia.
Anyone, we need to wrap up the meeting, but if anyone wants to say a few words, please.
Vitor, can I just add to that?
Yes.
As we move forward, I do think it's very important that we recognize that things will emerge. So we've had BSE, we've had Schmallenberg, we've had the COVID viruses that have come out of systems. We need surveillance, but I think it needs to recognize the complexities of our livestock systems, the livestock movements, the people involved in those systems. So it needs to capture that socioeconomic element to actually understand where risk problems actually sit. Because something will emerge that will actually be spread, and those movements are actually critical in terms of both understanding the risks and actually how we respond to them. And not forgetting these systems exist to feed us. So if we end up with overly concentrated points in those food systems or problems with regards movement of animals or livestock products, then we will have problems in the future. So I think just thinking that more carefully is going to be very important to us as we move to a less infectious population grouping, but with the emergence of other issues that are going to occur.
Okay.
I just want to say a big thank you to you, Vitor, for inviting me to speak today. It's been a pleasure to take part, and I hope in the future I can come back to Brazil again. So let's hope things go back to normal. Yeah, thank you. Well,
in a non-pandemic state, thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Sarah, as well. It was great. And Sylvia, would you like to say something, or can we close now?
We can close. I would like just to thank you all for this interesting discussion and presentations. And thank you, Vitor, for the invitation to join you today.
So thanks again to all of you. And I'll now sort of switch back to Portuguese so I can sort of just wrap up and close the whole meeting. Bom, gente, muito obrigado pela participação de todos. A gente encerra aqui, já é meio-dia. E eu gostaria mais uma vez de agradecer a todo o apoio técnico, né, da Finatec, da equipe que nos esteve apoiando, dos intérpretes, tradutores, e de todos que participaram, assistindo, fazendo perguntas. Espero que tenha sido uma contribuição para que esta discussão sobre aspectos económicos da saúde animal, da saúde pública, da saúde única, ganhe uma nova dimensão no Brasil, tá? Então, resta-me então agradecer de novo e podemos encerrar por aqui. Tá? Bom dia a todos.